The term environmental risk assessment is replaceable with ecological risk assessment. They are talking the same thing. When we talk about environmental, also include human. When we talk about ecological, sometimes we focus more on wildlife, the environment more. But in some cases, we also consider human health risk. Okay, now, since our center, our laboratory focusing on marine pollution, so in this presentation, I will focus on chemical pollution in aquatic environment. So, as I said before, now we manage the environmental quality based on environmental risk, okay? So the question is, how much can we pollute the environment without an acceptable consequence? So we have a rainbow of different level of pollution. If we aim to very, very clean water, then we have to have a cost to pay. Of course, we can use a very advanced reverse osmosis to clean everywhere, to clean all the water, but the cost is enormous. I mean, even Hong Kong is quite well-developed city, but we couldn't afford to have a tertiary water treatment for whole Hong Kong. Then we rely on secondary wastewater treatment. Then the effluent still contain a lot of pollutants in the water before discharging. So then we have to draw the line how much we can pollute without the unacceptable effect is the basic concept for modern environmental management. There is no way that we can achieve zero discharge nowadays because of the cost, and also another problem is long-range transport of pollutants. The pollutants can come from the sky, from the atmosphere, and also from the marine current. We cannot stop. Now, then we have to develop a system to assess the risk so that we can make a better decision. So the environmental risk assessment is actually a tool. Sorry, Professor Wu, would you mind mute your mic? Sorry. Okay, sorry about this. So the ERA is a tool enable us to objectively determine the probability or likelihood that contaminant release or process like hot water discharge, either in the past, current, and future, pose an unacceptable risk to human health or the environment. So based on the result, the decision makers can make informed decision in the risk characterization and the selection of cost-effective remedial cleanup measures. These tools have been widely adopted in various countries, including those in East Asia, in China, and Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. So these tools give us a very systematic way to evaluate organized data, available information. It also provides some basic assumptions when we run the risk assessment. It also allows us to assess the uncertainties in our prediction. So we can use these tools to cover all kinds of stresses from chemical, physical, and biological stresses, okay? Chemicals, pollutants, physical stresses like hot water or radioactivities. And then for biological, like pathogens, virus, we can also make use of this ERA2. So before we start the process, we have to define what is acceptable and not acceptable. So we have to define the adversity. it is not straightforward because a stressor may present a negative effect on one ecosystem, but may be good for the another one. For example, if we talk about ammonia as the stressors, it is very toxic to fish, but it is good for plant. If your ecosystem only concerned with plant, then that is good. But if your ecosystem considering all kinds of animals, then ammonia is no good. Then it depends on the situation. Then we have to define the adversity in site-specific manner. Then in general, the unacceptable changes or undesirable changes are those that can alter important structure and function of the ecosystem. Okay, then this is a common definition. If we try to protect the entire ecosystem, then we will look at whether this stressor will affect the ecosystem structure and their function. Okay, for example, providing oxygen for us to breathe, or providing the cleaning by the biowafts that we need for the environment. If those functions being diminished or removed, then we can see this is unacceptable. But very often we will try to look at the biodiversity, say how many species in the system now, and then whether such discharge of pollutants will reduce significant amount of species, leading to unacceptable concern, then we will draw the line there. So during the consideration, we will also take into account of the type, intensity, and scale of the stressor and their effects. And also we will try to look at the potential recovery. If the chemical pollutants will be degraded really shortly, only have a very short-term impact, and then the ecosystem can recover quickly, then the risk we are talking about is lower. Then those chemicals really persist and will have higher chance to be bioaccumulate in the biota, then the risk will be much higher. So all in all, the risk managers or the government must decide what is acceptable, the acceptability of the adverse effects, okay? This will form the basic baseline for the whole risk assessment process. Okay, now, okay. Now, in the process, we will use both qualitative approach and quantitative approach. Qualitative approach, we use a relative measure, high, low, large, and small. And then quantitative approach, we actually need to have data measurement to calculate the probability. So in the process, we have two types. One type is called prospective, the other one is retrospective. For example, for prospective one, maybe a company wants to launch a new chemical product, and then we want to test whether this product is safe to the environment and human health. And then we will judge whether this product can be launched to the market. If there's certain risk of this product, maybe we have to control the volume of production per year so that we will keep the discharge amount below the safety limit, ensure there will be no unacceptable consequence. So we use the results to predict for the future project, future action. If the risk of the chemicals is very high, then we abandon the proposal. We also have the situation that for legacy chemical pollution, we do the retrospective risk assessment. That means the chemical stresses or other stresses already existing in the ecosystem. Then we look backward. Based on all available information, we judge whether there is a causality, the the crisis or the damage of the environment actually linked to the discharge of that stresses. So we do it retrospectively, just like a detective policeman to go to crime case and then collect information to find the causality. Then in reality, both approach can be used at the same time. For example, we use a retrospective risk assessment to evaluate the cause of amphibian decline, okay? Then the result actually can be applied to predict the future of the amphibian population due to a proposal action or proposed stresses to be launched in the market. Then in this case, we have a combination of retrospective and prospective risk assessment together. Now, talk about the process. The process has three main steps: problem formulation, parallel analysis of exposure and effect, and then finally is a risk characterization. You can get a copy of this textbook from US EPA. I will provide you the link at the end of my presentation. So problem formulation, we need to define the problem, then what kind of stresses we're talking about, what are the receiver, what is the assessment endpoint, that means the unacceptable consequence we looking at. Then from there, we look at the actual or predicted exposure level and also compare the effect level. That means our threshold, effect threshold. Then we do a comparison, then we find out the risk level, and then that will trigger the management decision. So in the first step, during the problem formulation, we ask these questions. What is the stressor? Second one is, what is the sensitive receiver? The third one is, what is the assessment endpoint? What we're going to measure to evaluate the risk? And then how to conduct the entire process. Then we need a conceptual model and planning. So let me show you one example. For example, we're going to spray a new commercial biocide in the farm field using aeroplane like this. Then we have to ask how and what happened if we discharge this biocides in this big area. Then we can look at the food web structure. Very often we say if we can protect the top predator, the population still remain stable. That means the whole food web structure will be protected too. So very often the environmental authority will use the population parameter as the assessment endpoint. Sometimes they may use valuable fish species like salmon. They are sensitive to pollutants to look at the health of the aquatic ecosystem. So then they will use the reproduction parameter of the salmon as the measurement endpoint. So in terms of a conceptual model, then we will look at different pathway of the discharge process, air, soil, water, and then we look at different sensitive receiver, terrestrial vertebrates, terrestrial plant, aquatic invertebrate and vertebrates. And then we also try to work out what we're going to see changes if there is a disaster happen. So for example, we'll look at aquatic animals and plants to look at their survival, growth rate, and reproduction. So this framework have been used for the endosulfan. It's also a biocide in the farming site. So once you have this conceptual model, then we know what to measure. So if we want to look at the impact to the aquatic life, then we need to define the threshold for the survivalship, growth, and reproduction. Then use that as a benchmark, what we find, the concentration, if the chemicals have yet to release into environment, then we use model to work out the hypothetical exposure scenario. Then we compare it with the effect benchmark. We call it predicted no effect concentration. Then the next step is to compare the exposure against the toxic effect. But the process is not straightforward. We can define the toxicity like a effect concentration or lethal concentration. We can gather those data from laboratory. But at the same time, we also need to examine the exposure scenario. Will the chemicals come from the water, come from their food, or come from other land-based discharge? Then how often the organism will expose to such polluted water? Then it becomes all by chances, because different organisms have a different habit. They may not have the same kind of probability to expose to the same chemicals, okay? Even though they live in the same environment. So we have the probability, even for the same species of fish, some fish may be more susceptible to the toxicant, some don't. Some fish may prefer to hide away from pollutants, then they are cleaner than those fish doesn't care about the pollution level. Then you will create different probability of the encountering between these two parameters, toxicity and exposure. Let me show you one just example or analogy, okay? So if I'm talking about this malachite green, it's a fungicide, heavily used in fish farming in some region to protect the eyes of the fish won't become white in color, and also to protect them from secondary infections during the transportation. I think someone joined on the pot. I don't know whether I can clean it. It's okay now. So back to here. Then if I ask question whether it is safe for me to eat this fish with malachite green inside, then I just ask question if the level in the fish is lower than the recommended safe level, then I'm okay. So I can eat little bit of this chemical without too much harmful effects to me, okay? So, I don't know why I cannot go to next, okay, now, okay. Now, this is we call it, just now we call it lung cancer risk. We actually compare the intake levels against the reference dose in the fish, okay? If the intake lower than the reference dose, I'm safe. If higher, that means I shouldn't do it. Maybe we should stop selling the fish. Another factor is called cancer risk. The calculation using this equation, the amount of intake multiply this cancer slope factor. Normally, in normal situation, this is 10 to minus 6, okay? That means 1 in 1 million will have a chance to have cancer without taking any pollutants, okay? Then for those carcinogen or co-carcinogen, then this slope will go down to say 10 to -5 or, I'm sorry, 10 to -5 or even 10 to -3. So that means the chance of having cancer will be increased for those carcinogen compound. Okay, so by combining these two analyses, then we will know the risk level to me if I consume this fish. However, in the environment, we have many different species, not just one type of species, just human. In a marine system, very often we have over hundreds, even thousands species in the system. Then each species will have different response to the pollutants. That is the green distribution here. The orange distribution means the environmental concentration in the region. Some region closest to the river mouth, the discharge point, you're going to have a high concentration. But the area closer to the open ocean, then you will have lower pollution level. Then we have a barrel shape, very often we can see. Then we compare actually between the exposure against the effects. We compare two different distribution here. If they overlap, that means in certain case, they're risk over one by means of the ratio between the PEC and PNEC, the environmental concentration against the threshold. If they only touch a little bit, that means the risk is not too high. If they separate like this, that means no problem at all. So then we use the available information, we can judge the risk level of the stresses. We can apply this technology or approach in the oil drilling platform in Norway. We can have real-time risk map, then we can see when the risk quotient is higher than 1, is red in color, and then intermediate yellow color, then we know the risk in which area suffer more, then we can implement different management measure. Finally, the process is that once we have the risk characterization result, then the risk manager can make the following 3 decisions. 1, the chemicals or the stresses is safe, we can go ahead with the proposal and the project. In the second situation, the risk is very high of the chemicals of the stresses. We have to abandon the project, okay? Stop there. But very often we have the third scenario. There is some risk of the stresses, but it will give us benefit. Then we have to judge risk and benefits again. Then in that situation, we have to minimize the risk by restricting the discharge and also put some measures to control the discharge so that the levels in the environment remain acceptable. And we have to use risk management in this scenario. However, the concept of risk is very different among different people. So then the risk communication is very important. Even though we have scientific evidence saying that the risk is low, then you may find some chemicals inside the fish, say the mercury, the regulatory limit is 0.5 milligram per kilogram. So if we find 0.001 milligram per kilogram mercury in fish, okay? For some people, they say this is not acceptable, still have mercury, very dangerous for consumption. Then they may say that ignore our risk assessment and then ask everyone don't eat fish. And that will affect the fisherman and also the fishmonger who's selling the fish. They will suffer because people run away not eating the fish anymore. So once we have the result, we have to tell the people with scientific evidence and then tell them what to do. In fact, they can eat the fish. Maybe some species of fish will have higher concentration like those tuna. Then they should have less consumption, moderate consumption. We have to tell them how to behave so that they can minimize the risk of exposure. Then in the next lecture, I'm going to tell you more about the risk communication. Okay, so to end my lecture, I want to show you this video. Okay, it's a summary of what I said just now. Again, so let me remove that drawing first. Okay. Now, I hope you can you hear the sound? Grace, can you hear?
Hi there.
Okay.
My name is Jan, and I work at the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, where I'm involved in the environmental risk assessment of genetically modified plants. Today, I will briefly explain you.
Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. Okay.
Hi there. My name is Jan, and I work at the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, where I'm involved in the environmental risk assessment of genetically modified plants. Today, I will briefly explain you what we mean by environmental risk assessment and why it's so important. The environment is a broad concept that describes our biophysical surroundings. It includes air, water, land, and living organisms such as plant and wildlife. Environmental risk assessment is a scientific process that identifies and evaluates threats to the environment, in particular to living organisms, their habitats, and ecosystems. The causes of environmental threats are diverse.
Oh, sorry. I cannot click. Sorry. I shouldn't click on those.
So important. I will briefly explain you what we mean by environmental risk assessment and why it's so important. The environment is a broad concept that describes our biophysical surroundings. It includes air, water, land, and living organisms such as plant and wildlife. Environmental risk assessment is a scientific process that identifies and evaluates threats to the environment, in particular to living organisms, habitats, and ecosystems. The causes of environmental threats are diverse. Some are largely natural, for example, earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, whilst others might be the result of human activity, such as industrialization and urbanization. Think, for instance, about air pollution, toxic chemicals in food and water, poor housing, and sanitation. In the European food safety system, EFSA is responsible for carrying out risk assessment of products which may have a direct or indirect impact on food and feed safety. Because the use of these products may pose risks to the environment, EFSA also considers these environmental risks in its assessment. EFSA performs environmental risk assessment in a number of areas, such as genetically modified organisms, pesticides, plant pests, invasive plant species, and feed additives. The purpose of these assessments is to assess the seriousness and the likelihood of harm to the environment which might arise following a specific activity, such as the cultivation of a particular GM plant or the application of pesticides. These assessments follow several stages, beginning with problem formulation. Problem formulation is the first critical step because it defines the scope of the environmental risk assessment by specifying what needs to be protected from harm and by identifying potential harmful effects. Problem formulation is then followed by a hazard and an exposure characterization. In the hazard characterization, potential hazards and the seriousness of potential harm are examined, whilst the exposure characterization considers the likelihood and the level of exposure to the hazard, and thus how likely it is that harm will occur. The final step involves the characterization of risk. Here, the seriousness and the likelihood of harm are combined to estimate the level of risk. In some cases, the environmental risk assessment also includes risk mitigation measures. Such measures aim to reduce an identified risk to an acceptable level or a level of no concern. The environmental risk assessments carried out by EFSA help risk managers and policymakers at the European and national level to ensure that products that are put on the market do not cause unacceptable harm to the environment. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, great. We have to. So these are the link. You can download the reference I just used as a teaching material. And also there is a training website in the US EPA. You can go through the details step by step. So maybe I stop here, then we can have some discussion. I see how many of you have questions. Any questions? You can drop questions in the chat room as well. So, Jining, how much time I have for my second talk?
Oh, so you still have 9 minutes.
9 minutes.
Yeah. So we have plenty of time for discussion. Yeah.
Okay, then
so I open this for the floor. Yeah, for the audience.
So move on to next talk. Then, if no one asks questions, because I still have one more PowerPoint on the.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I still have. Let me see. I need to open that file first. Okay. Okay. Can you see the screen? I'm sorry, I bit overrun for the first talk, and then I will cut short of my second presentation.
Yeah. Professor Lang, we do have a question from a participant in the chat box. So Hildy asked, would standards for environmental quality be similar across the region? Thank you, Hildy.
Okay, that's a good question. The answer is yes or no, because we find that there are some regional differences of the chemical behavior because of different temperature. And also we find that different species composition in different regions also causing different response. So by and large, what we find is that tropical region and temperate region, cold water region should have different standards, okay? But for, say, for all tropical region in East Asia, I believe we can use one standard in the region. We can develop a set of standards for the region that is acceptable. That means those criteria established in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore should be quite relevant and can be used together. So the second question is, there is an allowable level, a substance in food like fish. How do we treat fat-soluble substance that can be biomagnified? That is also very good questions. In the very detailed risk assessment, we're not just looking at toxicity itself, but we also look at the bioaccumulative potential as well as carcinogenic potential. So then if the chemicals has a high tendency for biomagnification or bioaccumulation, then during the development of the criteria, that means the predicted no effect concentration, we will make use of a safety factor to make this PNEC level even lower. Okay, if they have high tendency, really persistent and bioaccumulate and biomagnify in the ecosystem, even though say the original PNEC is a 10 microgram per liter, now we have to divide it by an additional factor of 10. Then we tighten the criteria to 1 only. The original 10 now divided by 10, then it become 1. So then it depends on the intensity of the biomagnification. Then we will include a factor to encompass such impact. Okay, so then that means when we use that modified PNEC, already include a decision on the biomagnification issue. So I think this is a really good question. We must have a separate lecture just talking about how to develop a water quality criteria, food safety limit. We will be happy to do so in the future training workshop. I think this is a very good question. Okay, now let me move back to the risk communication. I will try to convince you risk communication is important through a lesson, a case study. Today, I won't have time to go through all the details, but I will share this PowerPoint with you, then you can read it. Now, let me start. Okay, so after doing the risk assessment process, we also have to do risk communication and risk management. Why this is important? I'll give you an example about biocide, DDT in seafood study. The people's perception is very different from the actual hazard, and also very often there's a rumor, there's a pest, the social media, they may give wrong impression to people. Say that all this mixed together, the perceptional risk is different from what we find from our scientific study. So there is fundamental saying that the risk that scare people and the risk that kill people are very different. But people often mix these two up, okay? And in the society, there are very diverse views on different environmental issues, food safety issues, because different stakeholders, they hold different agendas. For example, the NGO always want to have clean water, clean food, and push the government to do more. Then if just little bit of mercury being found in fish, they will say this will kill people. Then that will affect how citizens respond to the crisis. So very often such environmental crisis would lead to fear-driven, damaging public responses. So I give you one example. This was the newspaper in Hong Kong talking about the DDT levels in 70% of marine fish exceed the safety limit. And then you know what? After this newspaper came out, then the following days and weeks, no one buy fish to eat. So then the fishermen and also the fishmongers suffer a lot. But in actual fact, you still have other fish to eat. You have freshwater fish to eat. You still have 30% of fish without DDT. So then sometime in this crisis situation, if we cannot diffuse or channel our correct message to this society, that will create this unwanted response. So that's why risk communication is essential, because now we have the scientific evidence and then know what to do to minimize the risk. We have to share this information to citizens. So the risk communication is a two-way process, interactive process to exchange information with various stakeholders and the general public. And then at the same time, we try to ease the public concern, say the risk is low, and also there are alternative choice of fish to eat. And then we also tell them that those tainted or problematic fish, we will remove, and then we will ensure the confidence of the consumer, and then try to protect the fishermen and also the fish seller business. So we also need to well structure our message in different media, okay? For example, 30-second sound bites for TV news, 30 minutes in press conference. We also need to prepare different graphics and also the press release the key message to all the reporters. So we have some purpose for the risk communication. First, easy public concern, okay? Guide them how to respond, how to minimize the risk exposure, and try to listen to them and then understand their concern and then try to address their concern. Finally, we also explain the science and the nature of the risk assessment and the risk itself. And also we'll clearly tell the people that there's some uncertainty in the analysis. We will gather more information and then we'll update the people from time to time. So try to end this lecture with a real case study so that you know what I'm talking about. He was the food safety controller in Hong Kong, but now he retired already. When he started his job, then he has not much experience in risk communication. Then please hear what he said. I need to, I think maybe.
The biggest problem that we are concerned with is its effect on developing brain. That means the brain of developing fetus. A woman needs to take only 2 to 10 slices of sashimi. And if that kind of sashimi come from predatory fish with high level of mercury, that level may be excessive. All the fish that we have examined contain mercury at different level. And majority, over 95% of the fish contain a low level of mercury. So it's safe to consume fish. But a small proportion of fish contain high level of mercury, and some exceeded our regulatory limit of 500 microgram per kilogram.
So after hearing this, I would like to ask you whether you think you feel safe to eat fish. I think you may share with my feeling that it's not safe because the way he talking about the embryo brain development and then he said he didn't say pregnant woman. I assume he's talking about pregnant woman. Just take 2 to 10 slices of sashimi, assuming it will affect the fetus brain development, okay? Then I have a question because in any sashimi restaurant, the size of the slice would be different. In Hong Kong, in some sashimi restaurant actually have a very large slice. This is not really good for risk communication. It's better you using standard unit, like how many grams you eat, rather than using this jargon slide. And what kind of predatory fish, he didn't mention. And then he said that level may be exceed. What level, we don't know. And then most strikingly, he said something that all fish that we have examined contain mercury. That gives people the impression that all fish are not good to eat. Then he suddenly say, over 95% of them contain low level of mercury. How low? Then what is the definition of 95%? We should try to avoid using percentage in our communication. For example, if the government actually measured 2,000 fish, and then only 5% of them having an acceptable level of mercury, and then those samples including just 2 species, one is tuna fish, the other one is big eye. Then citizens should avoid to select these two species. Then people know what to do. You need to guide the correct behavior rather than sidetrack people, give this wrong message, then create unwanted response from the citizen. So this is a very good example case to tell you that we have to prepare our speech to the press in a very clear manner so that we can get the correct message across. So in the sense that we need to tell people what is the risks we're talking about, what are the fish with problem, people can have choices, and then how to minimize the risk. We also need to tell those sensitive groups like pregnant women, children, they must avoid consuming such kind of fish product. So this is a very good lesson for us to learn. Then in the process, I try to skip some slide because of the time. The idea is we should have a regular briefing with a centralized body, always the same people or same group of people disclose the latest result, because this risk assessment process should be a continuous process. Then we should provide accurate information. If we don't have the data, we just tell people that we will follow up, just tell the truth. Then there are 7 rules. PAM carefully evaluate the success of our communication effort. We keep evaluating, improving. Coordinate and collaborate with credible sources like professors in toxicology and food safety, and also medical doctors. Accept and involve the public as our partner. We work together, we listen to them and clear their concern. Listen to them, okay? Be honest, frank, and open. Never say no comment, because no comment has a hidden agenda, and then you will reduce the trust between the citizen and the authority. Speak clearly with compassion, meet the needs of the media and the society. So give you another example. After many years later, then I think the government have been improving a lot. Then this is a good one, and you can see.
The Center for Food Safety released its report on the first Hong Kong total diet study. It found Hong Kong people are unlikely to have major undesirable health effects from dioxins in food, though long-term exposure could cause cancer. The findings showed seafood, eggs, fats and oils, and meat contain dioxins. The 3 food items with the highest levels of dioxins are seafoods, mandarin fish, oysters, and pomfret fish. However, Center for Food Safety consultant Dr. Ho Yuk-in said people should not panic about eating fish, saying moderate consumption of a variety of seafood should not cause excessive exposure to dioxin. He also advised people trim fats from meat and consume low-fat dairy products to reduce dioxin intake.
So this is a good example because I want to go back to one slide. Let me find that. Sorry about this. Yes, the communication goal is that we need to ease public concern. Just tell people that the general risk is low. You have other choices of food. We just need to avoid those items, guide their behavior. That's very, very important. So I think at the end, through the learning curve, then the Center for Food Safety improved a lot over the years. Now the communication is much effective. So maybe I stop here, given the time, and then I can handle some questions from the student, from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for Professor Leung's and vivid examples and personal reflection in terms of environmental risk assessment or communication management, which makes a complex process quite clear, okay, more simple. And so there's a question, okay, from Razon Brando from University of Philippines, okay. So he asked about, in ERA, there is an allowable level of that can be biomagnified. Yeah,
I think I answered that one already. Just
yeah, already answered.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So then, any other questions? Any other questions from the audience, please? All right. Otherwise, we will have just because we have a little bit overrun. Maybe we take a 5-minute break. We shorten it and return to the platform on 35. Okay, of 10:35. Yeah. Thanks, Tay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.